I want to talk first about the society and tell you something that you probably know. This is one of the most important historical societies in New York State. And I base that on the fact that in 1955, the Huguenot Historical Society acquired the Hugo Freer homestead. I don't know which one that is, but it's out here somewhere. And, hey, Karen. And that was a historic moment because, let me read it to you. The Huguenot Historic Society acquired the Hugo Freer homestead in the oldest street in America in the spring of 1955. The society was following the trend of the times, and the trend of the times was to re-embrace the historical and heritage interests that New York State had been very engagingly involving back between the period of about 1890 to 1915, during the Hudson celebration years and the years in which A.J. Van Leer and other people in Albany produced so many wonderful historic documents, and monuments like Stony Point were created, and we really celebrated our heritage. And that was really the first wave of America's appreciation of the history that we had. And the second wave began really with this purchase in 1955, and it continues to this day. The concluding chapter of my second book, which I call A New Consciousness, relates to the concept that the attention paid to environmental issues, and particularly the Hudson River estuary in the wake of the Storm King controversy, and the rise of heritage tourism with the establishment of the National Heritage Act by President Clinton in Congress with Maurice Hinchey's assistance, really brought the two concepts together, environmentalism and heritage tourism or heritage issues, in a way that drives us today. I just would say that's why I have a good turnout these days, because people appreciate the quality of life that we have as a result of all this. I just wanted to add that Ellis Everett, you heard of him, the artist? So you know all this stuff. He died in '55. He had purchased and restored the Egram Hasbrook house on the same street in 1918 and enjoyed showing visitors the fireplace large enough to roast a pig and a cellar where cockfights were held centuries earlier. Everett's son Alf, the future Catskills historian, helped his father as a boy in renovating the house's unique staircase. More than 500 attended the village's stone house inspection day in 1956. That was a 6-year event, but really that was the first full year of this era of heritage appreciation that we live in and that began with this society. Let's talk about a couple of other things that are relevant to us for this today. One of them has to do, this is Black History Month, and next month is Women's History Month. And I did want to plug this particular event, the Linda Russell performance. That's probably going to be pretty cool. And I wanted to talk about women in Hudson Valley history here, because it's not a hidden history like the African American history actually is, but it certainly is suppressed. And I was curious about it myself after I finished the book, wondering how well I did. And Bill Rhodes asked me to come over to the Ulster County Historical Society at Beverly House and talk about women. And I did, and I had the two books, and I had gone through the books, and I put a little marker in every place where I mentioned a woman or had something that was relevant to women's history. And there must have been, 120 of them in there, and I held them up to Bill, and I said, "Geez, Bill, what do you want me to do? Spend the whole week here?" And we had a good time. I hope we have a good time today. Let's go back first to the anonymous women. Mary Ann Sears created a novel called Hudson River Crossroads back in the 60s that had a telling quote for me. She was saying how, we all learn history and read history about the great events that men create, but there's usually information about the lyings in, or lyings in. isn't that a term for having a baby? And that's true, isn't it? You know, we don't have, in this history, you know, we have some tragic story about children and about birth that resulted in deaths. But we don't have our Caesar or our special part of our history that has to do with an actual birth. But we do have the women who run through it so thoroughly. Going back in history, the first are the anonymous women who are the Native Americans. Of course, the Native American culture was matrilineal in nature, which is to say that basically the women took care of everything and ran the whole scene except for hunting and security and protection. But that was basically the men's job, although they helped out in planting times and times for the festivals and that. It was basically the women who ran society. And when the Europeans came, it was the women who had to deal with the Europeans even more than the soccer moms, the deal makers who the Europeans came to see. The Europeans took a special interest in the women. They were beautiful and passed along the venereal diseases the world had, and also caused a complete change, an abrupt change in how society worked and was managed. The women not only had to take care of these men who would come and live among them. They were called bushwhackers, which is a term that we still use today for, well, in this case, it's for young men who go out on their careers of becoming traders. And they also had to take care of the palace and do all of the domestic chores that were still associated with what the men didn't do. And of course, with the diseases and that, it was the men's population, the warriors, who fell off at first. So I think the figure was 90% of the people who lived in the Hudson Valley were dead or gone 40 years after Henry Hudson came here, largely because of the epidemics and the sicknesses that were brought. There were some wars that didn't account for that. Again, to the early Dutch period too, you don't see women's names pop up. You know, there was a child born here in 1614 or 1615. We know that from later history in the 1650s when that man was operating the sawmill that, the flour mill that his mother had actually created and had run for 30 years or more. The family name was Raphael. Early on in the women in the history, in the Dutch period, you do see the women emerge. Judith Stuyvesant is one of them, and she and her husband had a special consideration for African Americans, not like we would have today, but better than the English or the other Europeans. She was particularly distressed when, during the troubles that occurred at Wiltwyck, a number of African Americans were sent down to the Caribbean as slaves, and among them were some children. And she worked diligently to try and get one of those children back, but was unsuccessful at it. The Dutch allowed for marriages to take place among the African Americans, and they allowed them to land when they were manumitted. Under their rules, you could only own a slave for 20 years and then they would be free. So by the 1650s and 60s, there was a small community of free blacks who lived, down around South Street Seaport today, Smith's Valley, where the marsh was, or the Bly, the undesirable lands. And we see records of them, of the women emerged in that. In the English period, of course, women were treated badly, just as blacks were the worst under the Dutch period. But some women were granted some privileges. One of them was Margaret Hardenbach. And she married a trader. She was a trader herself under the Dutch. the Dutch were more liberal towards women. They allowed them to own businesses, to own land, to represent themselves in court. The English rule, that was not allowed, but Richard Nichols and his successors as governors understood that it was important to work with these people in order to ensure that the trade continued and not to interrupt commerce. So he allowed those privileges to continue. And she and her husband, she married a Phillips, Frederick Phillips. They became the richest people in the entire English period by trading mainly in African slaves, not here so much, but in Europe and in South America. Every one of us, in one form or another, is an immigrant. And I think we all understand that, some more than others. At least we know it intellectually. And the Huguenots and the other people escaping religious persecution or for some other reason who came over here and settled here, established families and established traditions and are all part of it. I'm a part of it, although my family, well, they came from different times, but most of them were German and Irish in the 1850s. You have a strain that goes back to Cotton Mather and back to Europe. But that's the way most of us, have our histories. We are all immigrants who are going back to it.